"Don't touch her," he said, and the entire hall went still. The words came from the far end of the winter court, low and calm, yet they carried through the polished stone like a bell. Mara froze with a silver tray in her hands, the warmth of the tea gone cold against her fingers. Every eye in the room turned toward her, toward the stain on her plain gray dress, toward the way she had been made to stand beside the noble's table like she did not belong anywhere else. The laughter had started only moments ago, soft at first, then sharper, crueler, as if her silence had invited it. She kept her head bowed, because that was safer, because looking up only made people remember how easy it was to look down on her. "You missed a spot," one woman had murmured, smiling into her wine. Then another had tipped a spoonful of cream onto the hem of Mara's skirt just to watch her flinch. It was a small humiliation, the kind that never made a mark anyone else could see, and yet Mara felt it burning all the way through her chest. She lowered the tray before her hands could shake too badly. In this court, even a servant was expected to accept mockery with a quiet face. Especially in Omega, no one had ever bothered to defend. "You heard me," the same voice said again, closer now, and this time no one laughed. Mara looked up before she could stop herself. He stood near the doors in a dark traveling cloak, snow melting from one shoulder, his posture still and unforced. Nothing about him looked like a threat at first glance. No crown flashed beneath the torchlight. No jeweled armor caught the eye. But the room had changed around him anyway, as if the air itself knew to make space. The guards straightened. A few of the older nobles paled. Mara did not know his name, only that his presence pressed strangely against her skin, like the memory of a voice she had heard in a dream and forgotten upon waking. One of the ladies gave a brittle laugh and said, "This is a private supper. We are not speaking to. You are speaking to someone who belongs here more than you do," he replied. The woman's smile vanished. Mara's heartbeat stumbled. No one ever spoke that way for her. No one ever spoke that way at all. She felt the eyes around her sharpen, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to reveal himself as just another man amused by the table's easy target. But he did not move, did not blink, did not break the silence until it became impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Mara could still feel the sticky edge of cream at her hem, the sting of embarrassment behind her eyes, the small ache of wanting to disappear. Yet beneath it all, something else stirred when he looked at her, something steady and unbearably warm, like the first light after a long storm. He took one step closer, then another, and when he stopped, his gaze rested on her face with a quiet certainty that made her breath catch. "What is your name?" he asked, as though the answer mattered. As though she mattered. Mara swallowed hard, and for the first time that night, no one in the hall was laughing anymore. Mara kept her chin lifted, though every muscle in her body wanted to fold in on itself. The silence in the hall had changed shape. It was no longer the cruel silence of people waiting to laugh. It was sharper now, watchful, uneasy, as if the room itself had felt the shift in him. She could still smell the sweetness of spilled cream clinging to her skirt, mixed with the smoke of candle wax and the heavy scent of polished wood. It made her stomach tighten. She wanted to wipe her hands on her apron, to hide the trembling in her fingers, but she did not dare move. Not when he was looking at her like that. The man in front of her did not wear a crown, but there was something in the way he stood that made the entire hall feel smaller. He was too still, too composed, with that dark, unreadable face and eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of light around him. Mara had seen men like him before, the kind who enjoyed being noticed, the kind who made a poor girl feel as if she were already guilty of something. But this man was different. He was not smiling. He was not amused. He looked as if he had stepped into the room and found something he had been searching for without knowing it. Her throat tightened. "Mara," she said at last, her voice thin at first, then steadier when she forced it to be. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone at the far end of the table let out a small, nervous breath. The man repeated the name in his head with quiet care, as though testing its shape. "Mara," he said softly. "That is a beautiful name." It should not have sounded so simple, but it did. The words landed on her like warmth. No one ever spoke to her that way. Not with respect. Not in front of others. Certainly not in a room like this. She lowered her eyes before he could see too much, but she could still feel his attention holding steady on her face. It was not the hungry attention men gave when they wanted something. It was not the bored attention of those who had already decided she was beneath them. It was worse in a way, because it made her feel seen. And being seen, after so many years of being overlooked, was almost more frightening than being ignored. Behind him, the table remained frozen. The woman who had laughed first now stared into her glass, cheeks tense. The elder beside her had gone stiff with disapproval, though even he seemed unwilling to speak too loudly. Everyone was waiting for the stranger to do something cruel, something theatrical, something that would restore the balance of the room. Instead, he turned slightly and reached for the chair beside him. He pulled it back with one controlled motion, the scrape of wood against stone cutting cleanly through the tension. Then he looked at Mara again. "Come here," he said, not as a command. Not exactly. More like an invitation that assumed she deserved to accept it. Mara did not move at first. Her heart was beating too hard. Her thoughts tangled with suspicion and disbelief. People like him did not invite girls like her anywhere. But then she saw it again in his expression, that strange steadiness, that patience. He was waiting, really waiting. So she took one slow step forward. Yet each time her fear threatened to drag her back, she remembered the way he had asked her name, as though it mattered. As though she mattered. When she reached the chair, he did not touch her. He simply looked down at the stained fabric at her waist, then back at her face, and the faintest shadow moved across his features. Not disgust, not mockery, something closer to concern. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. Mara hesitated. The room seemed to tighten around her answer. She could feel the old fear rising, the one that taught her to stay silent, to accept the slight, to keep her head down and survive. But the question was asked with such calm that it made lying feel impossible. "It was an accident," she said, because that was easier than admitting how quickly humiliation could be disguised as a joke. His gaze did not waver. "No," he said, almost gently. "It was not." The silence that followed felt heavier than music. Mara stood beside the chair with her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her fingers had gone pale, but she did not look away this time. No one in the room had ever asked her a question like that before. Not with patience, not with certainty, not as if the answer belonged to truth instead of blame. The man before her waited, and in that waiting there was a strange kind of mercy. Around them, the feast continued in fragments. The soft clink of silverware, the murmur of voices that had not yet realized something in the room had shifted, the faint crackle of candles burning low beneath the golden chandeliers. Mara could still feel the stares on her back, but they no longer felt quite as sharp. He had not moved to shield her. He had done something quieter and, somehow, more unsettling. He had believed her. That simple thing almost undid her. Her throat tightened. She looked down at the edge of the chair, at the polished wood, at the steady hands resting there as though he had all the time in the world. Her pulse fluttered once, hard and uncertain. "I stepped away to find a cloth," she said at last. Her voice came out softer than she wanted, but it did not break. "Someone called me back. When I turned, the wine was already on me." His eyes narrowed, not in anger toward her, but in recognition, as if every word fit into a pattern he had already suspected. "And they told you it was a mistake," he said. Mara gave the smallest nod. The shame of it still burned, not because of the stain itself, but because of how quickly the room had turned it into a joke. A test. Entertainment. She had spent so many years learning how to disappear before people decided she was worth laughing at. Tonight, she had not disappeared fast enough. The man studied her for another long moment. Then, without looking away from her, he lifted one hand and signaled to the nearest server. The young man almost tripped over himself in his haste to come forward. "Bring fresh water," he said, "and another cloth." Now, his tone was calm, but it carried enough authority to make the server hurry. Mara blinked. She had expected pity, perhaps, maybe a polite dismissal. She had not expected him to make the room pause for her, to place her humiliation in the center of the table and refuse to let anyone pretend it was nothing. The server hurried off. The conversation near the head of the hall thinned. More than one guest had begun to notice the change in the atmosphere, the way every word seemed to hesitate before being spoken. Mara became painfully aware of how visible she was standing there in her stained gown. But even then she did not feel as small as she had a few minutes before. That alone frightened her. Feeling seen had always been dangerous. People saw what they wanted to take. He glanced toward the gathering crowd, then back to her. Did anyone else touch you? The question was quiet, but it carried enough weight to make her breath catch. Her instinct was to answer quickly, to smooth the edges, to protect everyone from discomfort, even the people who had caused it. But something in his face stopped her from retreating into old habits. He was not asking like someone searching for gossip. He was asking like someone preparing to act on the truth. No, she said. Only the wine. His jaw tightened once. Not with rage, with restraint. And somehow that restraint made him seem more dangerous than if he had shouted. Mara saw then that he was choosing every movement, every breath, every word. He was holding himself back for her sake, and the realization moved through her like heat beneath the skin. She had never been worth anyone's restraint before. He reached for the cloth the server returned and, instead of handing it to her, set it carefully over the back of the chair. A small gesture. Almost nothing. Yet it made her chest ache in a place she had long ago taught herself not to feel. Sit, he said. She hesitated. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Only if you want to, he added, his voice easing just slightly. But you do not need to stand there and endure this for anyone's amusement. The words struck deeper than if he had raised his voice. Mara's lips parted, but no sound came. Her own thoughts seemed suddenly thin, fragile, unable to withstand the kindness in his tone. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the chair. It was not comfort. It was not rescue. But it was permission, and that felt almost more precious. For the first time that evening, her shoulders dropped an inch. Not enough to be noticed by the room. Enough to be felt by her. The man remained standing beside her, not over her, not in front of her, simply there, like a wall that had chosen not to close in. At the far end of the hall, one of the laughing women glanced toward them and quickly looked away. Another guest fell silent mid-sentence. The change spread outward in careful ripples, as if the entire room had begun to understand that something had gone wrong and that it could no longer remain invisible. Mara stared at her hands in her lap. They were trembling, though she was not sure when that had started. Perhaps they had always trembled. Perhaps she had only just finally noticed. Then the man spoke again, and his voice was lower this time, meant for her alone. Tell me your name again. Mara lifted her head. The question should not have felt different from the first, but it did. The first time he had asked, it had sounded like curiosity. This time, it sounded like a promise that he intended to remember the answer. Mara, she said. He repeated it once, quietly, as if testing how it sounded in the air between them. Mara, he said. And from where she sat, still stained, still unsure, still painfully aware of every eye in the room, she had the strange and dangerous feeling that her life had just begun to tilt towards something she could not yet name. Mara had learned, long before that night, how to make herself small enough to survive a room. She knew how to keep her shoulders tucked in, how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to fold her hands so no one noticed they were shaking. But sitting there now, with the great hall gone quiet around her, and the Alpha King still watching her like he had found something he was not prepared to lose, every old habit felt fragile. The silence did not feel empty. It felt charged, as if the room itself had leaned in to hear what would happen next. Mara swallowed and tried to steady her breathing. Her name still seemed to linger between them, warm and impossible, as though he had spoken it with care instead of authority. That was what unsettled her most. Not his power, not the eyes on her skin. It was the gentleness. She had spent years bracing for cruelty, for mockery, for the sharp kind of attention that cut and disappeared. This was different. This attention stayed. Across the chamber, someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Someone else cleared their throat. No one spoke. The Alpha King did not look away from her. He rested one hand on the carved arm of his throne, but he did not lean back into it the way a ruler would after making his point. Instead, he remained very still, as if any sudden movement might frighten her off. The realization made her chest tighten. He was giving her space. Space. That was more mercy than she had been offered in a long time. Mara, he said again, and this time there was no testing in it, only certainty. You have been standing at the edge of this room as if you expected to be sent away. What? The question landed softly, but it struck deep. Mara looked down at her stained dress, at the faint smudge at her sleeve, at the old scuffs on her shoes that had seen too many winters and too much work. How could she explain a lifetime of being looked through? How could she explain the reflex that told her she did not belong anywhere beautiful, anywhere watched? anywhere chosen. The truth rose in her throat, raw and simple. Because that is what people do, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried farther than she expected. A few heads turned. She heard a faint inhale from somewhere behind her. The Alpha King's expression changed, though only slightly. Something in his face hardened, not with anger, but with recognition. Not here, he said. The words were calm. Absolute. Then, before anyone could interrupt, he stood. The movement was so deliberate, so controlled, that the entire hall seemed to hold its breath with him. Mara's fingers tightened against her lap. Every instinct told her to shrink again, to look away before she drew more attention, but she could not. Not when he was looking at her, as though the room no longer existed. He descended the steps of the dais one by one, each footstep measured against the polished floor. No one stopped him. No one dared. When he reached the center of the hall, he stopped several feet from her, as though he understood that closeness could be a kind of pressure, and he had no intention of forcing it. "You are not invisible here," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The words settled through the chamber like a bell ringing once in a still forest. Mara felt it in her throat, in the tight place beneath her ribs, in the trembling of her hands. She had been seen before, of course. Seen and measured and dismissed. But this was something else. This was being seen without contempt. It was almost unbearable. Around them, the court remained frozen. Some of the women who had laughed earlier now stared at the floor. The men who had smirked before sat rigid and silent. Mara could feel the weight of all those eyes, but for the first time in her life, they did not feel like a sentence. They felt like an audience witnessing something they did not understand. The Alpha King lifted his gaze to the room, and his voice shifted, becoming the voice of command again, steady and unmistakable. "From this moment on, no one in my court will speak to Mara as if she is lesser. No one will mock her. No one will touch what is hers, and no one will decide where she belongs except her." A sharp silence followed. Mara's breath caught. Her heart thudded once, hard and disbelieving. Not because he had spoken for her, though that alone was enough to make her chest ache. It was the final line that reached her deepest, most guarded fear and answered it. Except her. No one had ever given her that much room to exist. The Alpha King turned back to her, and whatever hardness his order had carried softened again when it met her face. "Come," he said, and there was no pressure in it, only invitation. "Sit where you can breathe." Mara did not move at once. She could not. The hall had gone so quiet that she could hear the faint crackle of the torches along the walls, the whisper of fabric, the careful rhythm of her own pulse. Then, slowly she stood. The motion felt unreal, as if she were watching herself from far away. She took one step, then another. The space between her and the Alpha King shortened by inches, and with each one, she felt something inside her loosen, something old and tightly knotted beginning to unwind. He watched her approach without impatience, without triumph, only attention. When she reached the place beside the lower dais, he offered his hand not as a claim, but as a guide. Mara looked at it for one trembling second before placing her fingers in his palm. His touch was warm, steady, and careful, as if he understood she might vanish if handled carelessly. The contact sent a quiet shiver through her, not of fear this time, but of something far more dangerous. Hope. He led her to a seat near the front, one that had likely been intended for someone of rank, and when she hesitated again, he gave her the smallest nod, as if to say she had earned her place by simply existing. Mara sat. The room did not end. The world did not break. But something in her did shift. For years she had lived as though endurance were the same thing as living. Now, under the steady gaze of the Alpha King, she began to suspect there was a different life waiting, one that did not begin with apology, one that began with being claimed by truth instead of shame. And as he remained standing beside her, not as a ruler above a subject, but as a shield at her side, Mara understood with startling clarity that whatever came next would change everything. The chamber had gone so still that even the candle flames seemed to hesitate. Mara felt it in her bones before she understood it in her mind. The room was waiting for someone to speak, for someone to turn this fragile moment back into cruelty. She kept her hands folded in her lap, though her fingers trembled beneath the fabric. Beside her, the Alpha King did not move away. He remained near enough for her to feel the quiet strength of his presence, a steady warmth against the cold attention of the court. A woman in silver-trimmed robes rose from the far side of the hall, her expression sharpened by disapproval. "Your Majesty," she said, careful and formal, "surely this is not proper. A girl with no standing should not be placed among the honored seats." The words were polished, but the intent behind them was not. Mara felt them land like a familiar bruise. She lowered her gaze at once, the old instinct returning so quickly it almost made her ashamed of how natural it was. But the silence that followed was not the silence she expected. It did not belong to mockery. It belonged to command. The Alpha King's voice cut through the room, calm and unhurried. "She is not here by accident." No one breathed. He looked at the woman in the silver robe, then across the hall, letting every face understand that he was not asking permission from anyone. She stood when others looked away. She waited when others would have sent her out. She came with no demand for reward, and that is more than I can say for many who wear rank like a mask. Mara's throat tightened. She could not lift her eyes, but she could feel the change spreading through the room. The air had shifted. It was no longer a place where she could be dismissed without consequence. The Alpha King turned slightly toward her, and when he spoke again, his tone softened just enough to make it more powerful. "Stay where you are." 3 simple words. Not an order to be used. Not a command meant to shrink her. An instruction that told her she was allowed to remain. Mara exhaled shakily, the breath catching as if her body did not yet trust the safety offered to it. She had spent so many years making herself small that being seen felt almost unbearable. Yet he did not look away from her. He did not treat her like a passing mercy or a secret burden. He stood beside her as if her presence was something to honor, not excuse. Across the chamber, the silver-robed woman sat back down with her chin lifted too high and her pride visibly wounded. But even she could not undo what had happened. The line had been drawn. Mara had crossed into a world where her worth would be spoken aloud. Not because she had begged for it, because someone with the power to do so had chosen truth over convenience. Her pulse beat hard at her throat. She remembered every door closed in her face, every look that said she was less than she was. All of it seemed to gather behind her now like a long, fading shadow. And in front of her was something she had not dared to hope for, a future in which she would not need to apologize for existing. The Alpha King's hand rested briefly at the back of her chair, not touching her, only steadying the space around her. It was such a small gesture that most of the room would have missed it. Mara did not. It was the kind of kindness that changed the shape of a life. Her eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not when she was finally being given a place worth keeping. Somewhere deeper in the hall, a low murmur began to rise, uncertain at first, then softer, almost respectful. Mara did not know whether they were beginning to understand her or only beginning to fear what the Alpha King was willing to claim. Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that for the first time, the weight on her chest had eased. Not gone, not erased, but eased enough that she could breathe without pain. And when she gathered the courage to look up, she found him already watching her, his expression unreadable except for one thing she could feel with startling certainty. He had not brought her here to be tolerated. He had brought her here to be seen. The murmur in the hall did not fade. It shifted, like wind moving through tall grass, uneasy at first, and then slowly, almost reverently, as if the people around Mara were beginning to understand that something had changed in their midst. She kept her gaze lowered, not because she was ashamed now, but because she was afraid that if she looked too directly at the faces around her, she would see the old cruelty waiting there, ready to return the moment the spell of the evening broke. Yet no one laughed. No one spoke over her. No one told her to stand aside. That silence felt stranger than insult ever had. It felt like the world holding its breath. Mara could still feel the warmth of the cloak against her shoulders, heavy and protective, as if it carried more than fabric. It carried intention. It carried a promise she did not yet know how to trust. Across the hall, the Alpha King remained where he was, steady and unreadable, his attention fixed on her with a patience that unsettled her more than any sharp word could have. He did not demand gratitude. He did not force her forward. He simply waited, as if he understood that a frightened heart could not be rushed into believing what it had never been allowed to have. Mara swallowed and drew a careful breath. The room still felt too large, too bright, too full of watching eyes, But the fear was no longer the only thing she could feel. Beneath it, faint but real, was something else. Possibility. A beginning so fragile, she was afraid to touch it. Her fingers tightened once around the edge of the cloak, and when she finally lifted her eyes, she found the Alpha King watching her with a look that was quieter than the hall, deeper than ceremony, and far more dangerous to her peace. It was not hunger. It was not possession. It was recognition. The kind that made a lonely soul go still, because some part of it knew it had been found. Mara did not understand how one glance could feel like a threshold, but it did. She could sense the people around her changing in small, careful ways. A lowered chin here. A softened expression there. Not acceptance. Not yet. But the first uncertain signs of respect taking root where mockery had once lived. It was enough to make her chest ache. Enough to make her wonder whether kindness could truly remake a life that had been spent in survival. The thought frightened her almost as much as the memory of being unwanted. Because if this was real, then she could lose it. And loss, she knew, had teeth. She turned slightly, just enough to look toward the long table where the elders sat in formal ranks, their posture rigid, their faces guarded. None of them spoke. None of them dared to challenge what had already been declared without words. Mara had spent so long being measured by what she lacked that even this stillness felt like a miracle. But miracles, she had learned, were often only the quiet before someone decided to take them away. So she stood very still and waited. The Alpha King gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and one of his attendants stepped forward with a tray of water and bread, careful, respectful, as if offering treasure instead of a simple meal. Mara stared at it for a heartbeat too long. She had been given scraps before. She knew the difference. This was not an afterthought. This was a place at the table, however tentative, however newly earned. Her throat tightened painfully. She reached for the water first, hands unsteady, and the attendant did not flinch at her hesitation. That small mercy nearly undid her. Across the hall, the Alpha King's expression did not change, but his eyes did. They softened by a fraction, and Mara felt that change as surely as if he had spoken her name. Not to the room, to her. And in that silent exchange, something between them settled into place, fragile as glass, powerful as fate. Before the hall could settle into its new silence, Mara noticed something she had not seen at first. The attendants were no longer looking at her with pity or curiosity, but with a cautious kind of respect, as if her place had shifted and they were all waiting to understand how far it would go. She held the cup with both hands and let the warmth steady her fingers. The bread in front of her was plain, yet it felt like a feast after years of being told she should be grateful for less. Across the room, the Alpha King remained at the far end of the table, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable, but his attention never truly left her. Mara lowered her gaze, unsure whether to trust the strange calm settling over the hall. It felt too fragile for a place like this, too new to survive the sharp edges of old pride. Then one of the elder wolves rose from his seat, his voice measured and formal as he addressed the room. He spoke of protocols, of boundaries, of the need for patience while old wounds healed and alliances were tested. Mara listened without moving, aware that every word was also a warning. She did not belong here yet, not fully. That much the room was still trying to decide. But when the elder finished, the Alpha King spoke before anyone else could fill the silence. His voice was low, calm, and impossible to ignore. He said that no one would be asked to earn dignity through humiliation, and no one would be reduced to silence simply because others found their pain convenient. The words were not loud, but they landed with the weight of law. Mara's fingers tightened around the cup. She could feel the room change around that declaration, the way shoulders shifted, the way gazes dropped, the way old certainty began to crack at the edges. No one moved for several seconds. Then the Alpha King lifted his eyes to hers, and in that brief moment, she understood that he was not only protecting her from cruelty. He was making room for her to exist without apology. The realization moved through her so quickly it almost hurt. She had spent so long bracing for rejection that kindness now felt unreal, like standing in sunlight after years in a locked room. But the room was not done testing her. A younger wolf near the side of the hall finally scoffed under his breath, not quite brave enough to challenge the king directly, but careless enough to let contempt slip out. He muttered that mercy was easy from a throne, and that the weak often mistook pity for honor. Mara felt the sting of the words before she fully understood them. Her cheeks warmed. Her first instinct was the old one: to go still, to disappear, to make herself smaller so no one would notice the hurt. But the Alpha King's gaze sharpened at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He only said the young wolf's name, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. Then he reminded the room that strength without restraint was only fear in a louder form, and that any pack worth calling itself noble protected the vulnerable instead of feeding on them. The younger wolf looked down. No one laughed. No one defended him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was disciplined. It was correction. Mara felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She was still afraid, still uncertain, still learning the shape of this new life. But for the first time, the fear was no longer the loudest thing in the room. The Alpha King remained seated, but somehow he seemed to stand taller than anyone there. And Mara, still holding her cup, found herself looking at him not with dread, but with a cautious, trembling hope she did not yet dare to name. The hall had quieted, but the silence was no longer the kind that watched for weakness. It had changed, settling over the long tables like a steady winter mist, and Mara could feel every pair of eyes measuring the room differently now. No one was laughing at the young wolf. No one was daring him to lift his chin and risk being judged again. He sat with his shoulders bent, but there was relief in the small, almost invisible way his hands stopped trembling around his cup. Mara saw it, and something inside her eased, though only slightly. The Alpha King did not speak again right away. He remained at the far end of the hall, composed and unreadable, one hand resting loosely near his goblet, as if the entire room had simply aligned itself around his calm. Yet Mara could feel the weight of his attention like warmth at her back. It did not press. It did not demand. It simply stayed, and for reasons she did not understand, that steadiness felt more unfamiliar than the fear had. A servant moved quietly past, refilling cups, and the aroma of roasted herbs and sweet bread drifted through the hall. The ordinary life of the pack continued around the edges of something more important, something shifting beneath the surface like ice beginning to crack in spring. Mara lowered her gaze to her own hands. She had spent so many years expecting every glance to cut, every voice to mock, every small mistake to become proof that she did not belong. Even now, with the hall calmer than before, she could not fully trust the change. Yet the change was real. It lived in the posture of the wolves around her, in the way no one interrupted the young wolf when he finally murmured a quiet apology, in the way the elder woman beside him placed a hand over his knuckles and nodded once, as if to say that discipline could still leave room for mercy. Mara swallowed hard. She had not done anything grand. She had not challenged the Alpha King. She had not commanded the room. She had only spoken when silence had felt cruel. She had only listened when others expected her to turn away. And somehow, that had been enough to move something in the heart of a pack that had long mistaken hardness for strength. The Alpha King rose from his seat at last, and the movement drew the room into stillness without effort. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply crossed the hall with measured steps, the kind that made every head subtly turn. Mara watched him approach, the air around him seeming to grow clearer with every step, as if the room itself knew he carried authority like a second pulse. He stopped beside her, not too close, not too far. "You listened well today," he said, his tone quiet enough that only she could hear. Mara blinked, caught off guard by the simple sincerity in it. Praise was something she did not know how to wear. It felt almost heavier than criticism. "I only did what seemed right," she answered softly. His gaze rested on her face for a long moment, and she had the strange, unsettling sense that he was not merely seeing her, but remembering something she had not yet been told. "That," he said, "is often rarer than power." The words found her like a lantern in deep water. Before she could answer, a ripple moved through the room as the elder council began to stand, one after another, their expressions no longer guarded in the same old way. Mara felt the shift before she understood it. Respect was not being asked for. It was being offered, slowly, carefully, as though the pack had finally remembered how to kneel inwardly before truth instead of pride. And in that quiet unfolding, Mara felt the first small edge of belonging. Not triumph, not certainty, something gentler, something she had nearly forgotten was possible. The Alpha King turned slightly, as if to guide the room toward the next matter with the same unhurried control, and Mara realized that whatever had begun between them was no longer hidden in the edges of the hall. It had entered the center of it, quietly, irrevocably. And when his hand brushed the back of her chair in passing, not claiming, not commanding, only steadying, Mara looked up with a breath she did not know she had been holding, and found that the fear inside her had begun, at last, to loosen its grip. The great hall had gone quiet in a way that felt almost sacred, as if even the old stone walls were listening for what would come next. Mara stood near the edge of the gathering, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her fingers ached, watching the faces around her soften one by one. No one was laughing now. No one was looking at her like she had wandered in by mistake. The change was subtle, but it was real, and it moved through the room like dawn finding its way across a dark field. The Alpha King remained at the center of it all, calm and unreadable, his presence steady enough to steady everyone else. When his gaze found Mara again, it did not feel like a command. It felt like recognition, as though he had been waiting for the world to catch up to what he had already known. Mara drew in a slow breath, and for the first time in her life, she did not brace herself for the next wound. Instead, she waited. In the silence, a council elder stepped forward and bowed his head, speaking carefully, with the weight of every eye in the room upon him. His words were formal, but the meaning beneath them was plain. The pack would no longer question her place. The pack would no longer treat her as something lesser. Mara felt her throat tighten, not because the words were grand, but because they were late. And yet, somehow, they still mattered. The ache of years did not vanish in a single moment. It only loosened, one careful thread at a time. The woman who had once mocked her from across the room now looked away, ashamed in a way she did not know how to hide. Another wolf lowered his eyes. Then another. Mara did not savor it. She did not want their humiliation. She only wanted the strange, fragile peace of being seen without flinching. The Alpha King stepped closer, stopping just near enough that his shadow warmed the space beside her. His voice, when it came, was low and even, carrying to every corner of the hall without effort. He spoke of duty, of unity, of a pack that survived not because the strongest ruled the weakest, but because strength was meant to shelter, not to wound. Mara listened, still and open, and every word seemed to settle somewhere deep inside her, like rain finding dry earth. No one interrupted him. No one dared. It was not fear that held them silent now. It was understanding. Even the ones who had come to resist him seemed to feel the truth of it, however reluctantly. Mara lifted her eyes when he turned toward her again, and in that look she saw something that made her chest ache in the softest way. Not ownership, not pity. Choice. Clear, deliberate, and offered without pressure. He was not asking her to become smaller so that he could stand taller. He was inviting her to stand beside him as herself, fully and without apology. The room seemed to narrow around that moment, around the quiet exchange that mattered more than any decree. Mara's lips parted, but for a heartbeat no sound came. She had spent so long learning to survive being overlooked that being honored felt almost like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Then, finally, she found her voice. It was gentle, but steady. She did not thank him as one thanks a rescuer. She met his eyes and told him, softly, that she understood, that she would remember this, that she would not waste what had been given to her. Something in his expression shifted at that, a faint easing around the mouth, a warmth that he did not bother to hide. The hall seemed to breathe with them. Outside, somewhere beyond the tall windows, the wind moved through the trees in long silver waves. Inside, the future waited, patient and unwritten. Mara felt it then, not as a grand prophecy, but as a living thing growing quietly between one heartbeat and the next. Whatever came after this, she would not face it alone. And that, more than any crown, more than any title, felt like the beginning of a life she had never dared to imagine. Mara stood beside the tall windows long after the hall had begun to empty, the candlelight softening the gold edges of the room until everything looked touched by dusk. The silence around her no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. She could still feel the weight of the moment in her chest, that strange, quiet wonder of being seen without needing to defend every breath she took. Across the room, The Alpha King watched her with the kind of stillness that made the air feel deliberate. He did not come closer right away. He only held her gaze, as if giving her the dignity of choosing her own steps. Mara understood that more than she could have explained. She had spent so long being pushed, corrected, dismissed, and measured by people who never paused to ask what she wanted. Now, in this room of old stone and murmured power, no one was asking her to shrink. It made her shoulders loosen in a way that almost startled her. A servant passed quietly with a tray of tea, and the warm, herbal scent drifted between them like a soft promise. Mara accepted the cup with both hands, feeling the heat steady her fingers. She remembered the strange calm in the Alpha King's voice when he had spoken her name, not as an order, not as a test, but as if it mattered. That memory stayed with her now, bright as a lantern in the dark. He finally crossed the room, his steps unhurried, his presence calm enough to settle the air around them. "Are you well?" he asked. It was such a simple question that for a moment she did not know how to answer it. No one had asked her that in a way that sounded sincere. No one had made it feel safe to say yes or no. Mara looked down at the tea, then back up at him. "I think," she said carefully, "I am beginning to be." The corner of his mouth shifted, almost a smile, though softer than that. Something thoughtful moved behind his eyes, something old and guarded and unexpectedly gentle. "Good," he said. "Then that is enough for tonight." The words landed in her like a hand laid flat over a restless heart. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the scent of rain from the forest beyond the palace grounds. Mara turned her head toward the dark glass and saw only her reflection at first, pale and uncertain, and beside it, the faint outline of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. She thought of the road that had brought her here, of the places where people had looked through her instead of at her, of every time she had been told to endure quietly and ask for nothing. That life already felt distant, as if it belonged to someone she had once known but could no longer become again. The Alpha King followed her gaze to the window, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, meant only for her. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will not be standing behind anyone." Mara turned slowly toward him, the meaning of his words settling deep within her. He was not promising a fantasy. He was promising space, recognition, a place where she would not have to bow to be allowed to remain. Her throat tightened, but not with fear, with relief so clean it almost hurt. "I do not know how to be someone like that yet," she admitted. He studied her with quiet patience, as if he had all the time in the world and no desire to take more than she was ready to give. "Then you will learn," he said, "and I will not ask you to learn alone." The room seemed to grow still around them, the last of the evening settling like silver dust across the floor. Mara felt the truth of his words before she fully understood them. There were battles ahead, old loyalties, old cruelties, old wounds that would not vanish simply because one kind act had changed the shape of her night. But something had shifted in the foundation of her life. She could feel it, not like thunder, like roots finding water. For the first time, the future did not feel like a sentence waiting to be pronounced. It felt like a door left open. And when the Alpha King extended his hand, not demanding, not insisting, only offering, Mara placed her fingers in his palm and felt the steady certainty of being chosen with care. The warmth of his hand was real. The promise in it was real. In that small and sacred moment, beneath the fading candlelight and the watchful hush of the palace, Mara understood that destiny was not always a storm. Sometimes it arrived quietly, with patient hands, and asked only whether she was ready to step forward. The next morning did not arrive softly. It came with pale lights spilling over the palace windows and servants moving through the halls with careful, measured steps, as if the entire court had learned to breathe around a new and fragile truth. Mara stood near the tall mirror in a borrowed dress the color of winter wheat, her hands folded so tightly at her waist that her knuckles had gone white. She could still feel the memory of the Alpha King's hand in hers, not as a dream, as proof. Every quiet movement in the room seemed to say the same thing. She had not imagined it. He had offered. She had accepted. And now the world would have to decide what to do with that. Across the corridor, voices drifted through the open archway, low and sharp, then hushed again. Mara caught pieces of them. Questions, doubt, unease. A servant passed the doorway and lowered her eyes too quickly, as though looking at Mara for too long might invite trouble. She knew that look. She had worn it herself for years. The look that said this person does not belong here, not really. But when she turned toward the window, the sun touched the floor in a clean gold line, and she found herself standing inside it without fear. That alone felt like a miracle. A knock sounded at the door. Not hurried, not cruel, steady. Mara opened it to find a palace attendant holding a folded cloak of deep silver fabric. His Majesty asked that you wear this, the woman said, her tone careful, almost respectful. There will be a gathering in the West Hall. Mara reached for the cloak with both hands. The fabric was warm from being held near the body, and when she brushed it against her arm, she felt a strange and quiet shiver move through her. Not from cold, from the weight of being seen. Thank you, she said softly. The attendant hesitated, then gave her a brief nod before retreating down the hall. Mara stared at the cloak for a long moment before draping it over her shoulders. It was too fine for someone like her. Everyone would notice. That was the point. She knew it before she even stepped into the corridor. By the time she reached the West Hall, the air had changed. Conversations paused when she entered. Heads turned. Eyes measured her from a distance, some curious, some cold, some openly disbelieving. Mara kept her chin level and her steps even. She had walked through rooms full of judgment before. She had learned how to carry herself through the ache. At the center of the hall stood a long table lit by morning firelight, and at its head was the Alpha King. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened at once, as if the room itself had become quieter simply because she was there. He rose, not because he had to, because he wanted to. The movement drew every eye in the hall, and the silence that followed was deep enough to feel. Come here, Mara, he said, his voice calm and unmistakable. No command in it, only welcome. Her breath caught, but she moved toward him. Every step felt heavier than the one before, not from fear now, but from the strange, bright danger of hope. When she reached the table, he lifted the silver cloak from her shoulders with deliberate care and settled it properly around her. The gesture was so gentle that it made several faces in the room tighten with surprise. His fingers lingered only a moment at the edge of the clasp before he looked down at her and said, "You will not be made to stand at the edge of any room in this palace." Mara looked up at him, and for a heartbeat she forgot who was watching. She only saw the steadiness in his eyes, the quiet certainty there, the kind of regard that did not ask her to earn it. A murmur moved through the hall, then fell away when an older council member cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the court will expect explanation." The Alpha King did not look away from Mara. "Then the court will learn," he replied. His voice remained even, but the air changed around it. "They will learn that strength is not always loud. They will learn that dignity does not belong only to those who have always been protected." No one spoke. Mara felt the heat rise behind her eyes, but she would not let it fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Not when the first thing in her life that had ever felt like honor was resting on her shoulders like a cloak of light. Then, from the far end of the hall, a young servant hurried in and bowed so quickly that he nearly lost his balance. "My king," he said, breathless, "the eastern border riders have arrived. They say the neighboring pack is demanding an answer before sunset." The room sharpened instantly. Even the lamps seemed to brighten with the sudden tension. Mara felt the shift in the air before anyone spoke again. This was not a celebration after all. It was the beginning of a test. The Alpha King's hand moved, not to shield her, but to rest briefly over her wrist, a silent question and a silent promise at once. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Then we will answer them." Mara held his gaze, and in that look she understood something deeper than affection or protection. He was not only offering her a place beside him, he was placing a future in her hands and trusting her to stand within it. Outside, the palace bells began to ring, low and solemn across the morning air. Inside, the hall waited for what would come next, and Mara, once spoken of as if she were easily broken, lifted her chin beneath the silver cloak and stepped forward with the Alpha King at her side. Mara stepped beside the Alpha King as the palace doors opened wider, and the morning light spilled across the marble floor like a pale ribbon of gold. The hall beyond was already full, every noble face turned toward them with careful smiles that did not quite hide their judgment. Mara felt it at once, That old familiar pressure, the one that always seemed to settle on her shoulders whenever a room decided who she was before she had spoken a single word. Yet today, something was different. She was no longer standing alone. The silver cloak at her back brushed softly against her arms, and the warmth of the Alpha King beside her made her breathe a little easier, even when the silence in the hall grew sharp enough to sting. At the far end of the chamber, the council had gathered in a half-circle beneath the carved banners of the realm. Their jeweled rings flashed as they shifted, their eyes moving from the king to Mara, then away again, as if she were a question they had no intention of answering kindly. One elder lifted his chin. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice measured and smooth. "Before the pledges are spoken, the court requests clarity." Mara kept her face still. She had learned long ago that stillness was sometimes the only shield left to her. The Alpha King did not move immediately. He only looked at the elder with calm, unreadable eyes, and in that pause the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Speak," he said at last. The elder folded his hands. "The matter is simple. A king's choice must strengthen the realm. The woman beside you may be brave, but bravery does not make a Luna. The people will want proof that this bond is not sentiment, but destiny." A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Mara felt it rise around her like cold mist. Proof. As if her worth could be measured by the comfort of men who had never bothered to learn her name. Her fingers curled once beneath the edge of the cloak, then eased again. She would not shrink. Not here. Not now. Before she could speak, another voice carried from the side aisle, light and almost amused. "Perhaps the court fears that destiny has a mind of its own." The chamber turned. A young messenger, no older than 20, stood with a sealed silver packet in his hands. He looked nervous, but his gaze remained fixed on the king. "A sealed report from the border shrine arrived moments ago, Your Majesty. It was sent before dawn." The Alpha King extended one hand. The messenger crossed the floor quickly and placed the packet into his palm. For one long breath, no one moved. Then the seal broke. Mara watched the king read. She saw the change first in his eyes, then in the line of his mouth, then in the way his shoulders seemed to settle as if some long burden had finally found its resting place. When he looked up, the hall had gone unnaturally quiet. "The shrine keeps records of scent and bloodline," he said, his voice low and clear. And at dawn, it confirmed what the moon already knew. The elder frowned. "Your Majesty?" The king turned slightly, his gaze finding Mara with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "She is not here by accident," he said. "She is not a convenience. She is not a symbol to be discussed while she stands in the room." His voice deepened, carrying across the chamber with quiet force. "Mara is the one the old rites have been waiting for." The words landed like light breaking through clouds. Mara could feel every eye in the hall shift, every breath catch, every whisper die before it could form. The elder's face lost some of its color. The king lifted the sealed report just enough for all to see. "The shrine has named her as blood of the first line." A wave of shock moved through the court, so fast it seemed to steal the air. Mara stood very still, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt, but not from fear this time. From the strange, trembling weight of being seen. At once, the mood in the hall changed. Those who had looked past her now stared as if they were seeing her for the first time. Those who had doubted her now could not hide it, and those who had whispered would have gladly swallowed their words if they could. The Alpha King lowered the report and took one deliberate step closer to Mara. "You wanted proof," he said to the council, though his eyes never left her. "Here it is. The realm will honor her because the realm has already recognized her." Mara lifted her chin, and for the first time that morning, her voice did not tremble when she spoke. "I did not ask to be believed because I was useful," she said softly. "I only wanted to be treated as if I belonged." The silence that followed was complete. Then, slowly, the Alpha King offered his hand to her, not as an order, not as a display, but as a choice made before all witnesses. Mara placed her fingers in his, and the chamber seemed to exhale around them. Outside, the bells continued to ring, but now they sounded less like an omen and more like a vow. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, the first rays of true morning began to spread over the city, as if the world itself had finally decided to make room for her. Mara let the weight of the chamber settle around her without shrinking beneath it. The council had gone still, not for mercy, but from the strange discomfort of realizing they had been wrong in front of one another. She felt it in the air, in the careful silence, in the way every noble now watched her, as if she had changed shape simply by refusing to bow. Beside her, the Alpha King did not release her hand. He stood steady, calm, almost unbearably composed, as if this had always been the only outcome that made sense. Mara looked up once, just once, and found his expression unreadable except for the warmth that softened the line of his mouth. It was not triumph she saw there. It was recognition. That was what unsettled her most. Not that he had defended her, but that he seemed to have been waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew. A servant crossed the marble floor with a silver tray, careful and silent, and the sound of it seemed louder than any speech. Somewhere near the windows, sunlight gathered in a pale wash across the stone, touching the edges of the banners, the pillars, the polished floor, as if the morning itself had entered the room to witness what no one else had been brave enough to say aloud. Mara's pulse had not fully settled. Her fingers were still warm where his hand held hers, and that small steadiness reached deeper than praise ever could. She had spent so long being measured by what she lacked, by what others thought she could not offer, that even now her mind struggled to accept the quiet dignity of being chosen without conditions. The king turned slightly, just enough for the council to see the strength in his posture and the gentleness in his restraint. "From this moment," he said, his voice low but carrying cleanly through the hall, "no one will speak of her as though she stands outside this realm. She is not a guest here. She is not an exception. She is part of the heart of this kingdom." A few faces tightened. A few looked away. Mara did not. She felt the words settle around her like a cloak placed over bare shoulders after too many cold seasons. Not because they erased the past. Nothing could do that. But because they gave her something she had never been allowed to wear before. Belonging, spoken out loud, with witnesses. One of the elder advisors cleared his throat, as if he had intended to object, but the sound died before it became a sentence. The Alpha King's gaze moved across the room with quiet authority, and no one challenged him. Not after what they had seen. Not after the way he had placed her hand in his, as if her presence beside him was not a concession, but a truth. Mara drew a slow breath and found, to her surprise, that the trembling had nearly left her voice. "Then let it begin," she said, and the words were soft, but they carried. The nearest council members turned toward her, startled by the calm in her tone. She felt their attention, felt the shape of it, and for the first time she did not flinch away from being seen. The king's thumb brushed once over her knuckles, a small gesture, almost private, and yet it steadied her more than any public declaration ever could. Outside the tall arched windows, the city stirred beneath the pale gold of morning. Market carts rolled over cobblestones. Distant bells rang from the upper district. People who had not yet learned the full story were already sensing that something had shifted inside the palace walls, that the air had changed, that the old order had begun to crack in the quiet place where certainty used to live. Mara could feel the shape of that change too, not as fear, but as possibility. It stood before her like an open door. The Alpha King finally released her hand only to step half a pace aside, making room for her without moving away. That simple act undid something inside her. He was not keeping her hidden. He was not speaking for her. He was standing with her while she found her own voice. And when she looked at him again, she saw the future there, not as a grand promise, but as a path waiting to be walked step by step, in the open, under the morning light. Somewhere deep in the palace, a door opened, and the sound traveled down the corridor like the start of a new chapter.